Hey, my friends, Dr. David Hall here with Church Psychology. In today's episode, Matt had got us talking about an article that he had recently come across about the psychology of small talk, and specifically, what are the things that make small talk engaging and effective as a building block of connecting with other people. I think oftentimes we'll be dismissive of small talk. I feel even in my thinking in the past, I've been dismissive of small talk as unimportant. But we get into an interesting conversation about just the meaning of how we step out of ourselves in conversation and how winsome and appealing that can really be to other people. And in the context of being fruitful and good in our relationships, I think it was a good conversation. So I hope you join us for that. We're going to slide into that intro music now.
Welcome to Church Psychology, a podcast of the Negev Institute. We are mental health professionals looking at the intersections of social and behavioral science in the Christian life. Please connect with our free resources in our open community library at churchpsychology.org. We would be grateful if you would follow, like, or subscribe to Church Psychology wherever you are finding us, and also leave us a review. As we start, if we are to love the Lord our God with all of our mind, it makes sense to work on our headspace. So let's get to work. Welcome, everybody, back to the Church Psychology Podcast. I'm Matt Schoeneman. I'm here again with Dr. David Hall. Hey, David.
Hello, Matt. Hope you're back. Hope people are back to this. Or if this is your first time, welcome.
Welcome to episode 20, everybody. That's double.
Yeah.
Well, it's double digits for a while.
Yeah, it's been double digits for but it's another ranking.
It feels like a good,
It is. Well, a lot of podcasts, a very common thing in podcasts is this thing called pod fading, where people will do a few episodes and just sort of fades out.
Yeah.
And we're
not
already
us, baby.
Yeah, we're already well past that norm, because we are just so thrilled to listen to ourselves talk.
Like you said in the past episode, you were like, "Who is this?
Is this bozo?
Bozo that's on the radio? Yeah. Listen to us. Radio. Who actually listens to the radio anymore?
My car turns it on sometimes.
Yeah.
Like sometimes, not all the times, but sometimes if I've just taken a call and get off it, it'd be like, "Oh, you want to listen to the radio now?" I'm like, "No."
What radio station does it go to?
It's like talk radios that's on right now or something like
Which
that.
one?
I'm not sure.
Which one?
I can't remember.
It will define you of your political leaning.
Well, I didn't set it. It's just what was there in the car. So, anyway,
okay, sure.
So typically,
Yes.
as Matt jokes, it's oftentimes I've come in with an agenda to our episodes, but that something I was thinking about, and Matt and I will discuss episode topics beforehand, but I will more often than not be the one that pitches something. But the upshot of that is that, I'm the one that also has to research and plan the episode of like, okay, well, what is this going to be? And Matt sent me this article the other day.
Well, actually,
yeah,
I posted the article somewhere or put it somewhere. You saw it, and then you were like, "We should do that," and I was like, "That's great." Yeah. So to be fair to you, you pitched it as an idea.
Sure. But the idea
I did not have the forethought to be like, we should talk about this, so
yeah,
I appreciate that.
You're correct in that.
Yeah.
And so, what's the article about?
Yeah. Well, I read randomly just on the Apple News app an article, and I think it was also through CNBC. I can't remember, but there was this researcher writer from Stanford. I think his name's Matt Abrams, but he wrote an article, said the number one phrase people who are good at small talk always use, and this says Stanford public speaking expert. And so basically,
that's clickbaity.
I know.
Yeah.
But in a sense, I looked at it and it started to discuss the aspect of like what are ways that small talk works, or like what kind of captures people's ability to kind of feel, essentially be feeling like seen or heard in a conversation, and not just be kind of surface level the whole time. And I think he's writing from a perspective of probably business connection and even in relationships of friendships and family relationships. And so it was a short article, but it made us think, I think, on a really good topic of like, whether it's small talk or conversation, but what's really there.
Mhm,
And so,
mhm.
um,
Yeah, and I'm very interested to kind of unpack some of that with you, and the link to the article will be in the show notes. But before we get into that, I'm trying to
oh,
set this
yes.
habit. I've skipped a few episodes because I always just kind of want to do an additional reminder for people.
Mhm.
For those who appreciate this podcast, you want to support us. We're not asking for your money at this point. We might in the future, but no, we don't have a Patreon set
Yet.
up yet.
Yet.
But
Yes.
the biggest way that you can support us is to connect with us in our free community library, which is part of the Negev Institute. If you go to the podcast website, churchpsychology.org, you can get your free, it
Mhm.
looks like a library card. And what that does is it gives you access to specific trainings that we put out for free. We've got a few on there at time of recording around social media. It also is an automatic connection to our email list. There's nothing paid in this, but it's just a way that we can reach out to you directly as we have new episodes come out, as different articles. We really wanted this uh, podcast to be part of community conversations
That's right.
and to really want to include people in those community conversations. That's the best way that you can support us right now, is just letting us kind of connect with you in that way. So again, churchpsychology.org, sign up for your free community library access. It is completely free, and there's certain content that we're going to put out that's out there now, and we'll continue to put out that is exclusive to that
Mm.
free
Yeah.
membership. So please
Yeah.
check it out. Again, churchpsychology.org.
Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing that. And
So small
so
talk.
small talk, the one thing that I think a lot of people fear, well, actually, that and deep talk, actually. No, but there's a level to which, how at least did this writer conclude what is the number one phrase,
Mhm.
um, and to not pull that tension any further. The number one phrase that he says is most helpful is the phrase "Tell me more."
Hmm.
Um,
Tell me more, man.
I will. There is so thinking of that phrase when you have conversations with somebody, and they are explaining something about whatever their work, their kids, their life, and you offer the phrase, or someone has offered you the phrase of "Tell me more," like, "Hey, yeah, what's that like?" Or "Tell me more about that." And you start going deeper. I think there's a level to which we feel uh, im I can't think of the word. Maybe it's important. It's,
Feel like
um,
we matter to the other
we
person
matter
because
to the other person. Exactly. And so he broke it down into 2 phrases, and, I'm kinda using his stuff, and then I think we should, go deeper into some of the things
Mhm,
that, our counseling
mhm,
work has taught us in conversation, but he broke it down into 2 things of there are supportive responses and there's shift responses. What he talks about as supportive responses are these things that support what the other person is saying. And so it's any kind of language in a conversation that you are continuing that person to go whether deeper or further into what is being talked about. Even if it's whatever, UT football, like we're talking about
go Vols.
go Vols, what's going on there? Like to ask maybe, tell me more is one phrase, and you can tell me more about that. And if you overuse that, that could probably be annoying to the other person. But I think of even like kind of curiosity phrases, of how long have you been, you know, watching the Vols, or what does this, mean to you, or whatever that kind of conversation that is supporting what they're saying to you,
Mhm,
is the most effective for small talk to be, good, or that
mhm,
people that are good at it are doing that. What
hmm,
shuts down conversations, and I don't know if he uses that language, but in a sense of how I read it, is what shuts down conversations are on the opposite of that is what's called a shift response. It's the statement that shifts the conversation back to you. So we're talking about UT football and talking about the Vols, and the focus of the conversation at start is this person's telling me about, oh, they just went to the game and how much fun there was and all that stuff. If I shift the response to be like, oh yeah, well, I went to a game back then and it was a lot of fun. The
Mhm.
conversation essentially dies until someone else
Mhm.
like brings up another topic.
Mhm.
And so often I think what happens when we have small talk conversations is that we get nervous, and the only thing that we really have any kind of expertise on is ourself. And so then we use that self-knowledge to then add to the conversation, almost like we have to deposit into this
Mhm.
bank, and if we don't do it enough, then the conversation dies.
Mhm.
Um, but that will essentially kill it, and it makes the person feel like less seen, less heard, less
Mhm.
known.
Mhm.
And so those two things, that's maybe new language. It was new language to me to even look at as supportive responses and shift responses. But I thought that was a good way to maybe break apart what it's
Mhm.
like when we have conversation. And the way I'm thinking about this is not so much as much with people that we know really well, but
Mhm.
maybe more in, let's say you have to go to some fundraising event or some um, church gathering, and you're
Mhm.
around a lot of people that you haven't really talked to much, and so
Mhm.
you're sitting at a table with pseudo strangers, and how do you carry on conversation there?
Mhm.
And I've felt this in both ways.
Yeah. The what struck me in considering it, seeing the article as you posted it, and, I've said, I think I've even said in this podcast before, that I have a difficulty with small talk, and, but the more I kinda thought about it, that's not true. In fact, I do small talk all the time. I don't like, um, empty talk in the sense
Mm,
that I don't like really talking about things that feel really
shallow.
shallow and unimportant or uninteresting to me. And even shallow is the thing. Like lots of things can be shallow and can be fine. Like,
Mm,
but I don't want to. For anybody who I have in my life to any meaningful way, I don't want to just talk about that. You bring up sports or something like that. Like um, I've got two nephews that are really into sports, and if I let them, every conversation we talk about could be about sports, and I don't for two reasons. One, I don't know most about what they're talking about. So that keeps me from participating fully in the conversation because they're bringing up baseball players or things like that, and I'm not a real sports guy, and, like, I can, you know, my level of knowledge is much more limited than theirs is, so I can't participate. That's one reason. But the other is like I wanna talk about other things about them,
mm.
and so I think sometimes we'll have this idea that talk can be shallow or deep, and, like, deep is good and shallow is bad, and I don't necessarily think that's the case. Even in counseling, um, you can go too deep too quickly in counseling conversations, and you're starting a new relationship with somebody. You've got to figure out, and that's part of the skill of a good counselor,
Mm.
how to not waste time or be trivial. But sometimes we've got to walk into something not at full speed because of the level of trust. We're and there could be lots of things to learn from kind of the initial, more shallow conversations before you go deep. Somebody who has to have a deep conversation about everything, that can feel like an exhausting relationship, that everything is just so weighty all the time. So, I found this, just really interesting to kinda consider of just how we engage with other people.
Well,
And
one of the things, so you brought up the concept of your um, nephews really enjoying
Mhm,
sports, and
mhm,
sometimes it feels uncomfortable to have conversation about it, mainly because you don't know much about it. I
mhm,
like the idea of like switching the topic, that you're not only sports to me. Like I want to know these
mhm,
other parts of your life.
mhm,
But one thing I've realized, even in my work with adolescents and teens in counseling, that I've found has been very helpful in building rapport and connection with the other person, is to talk about things that they really enjoy. But oftentimes I don't know much about it.
mhm,
So for instance, when I have a teenager in my office that is really into gaming,
mhm,
there's aspects of gaming that I understand. Like maybe back in the day, I would do that some, but I have been disconnected from that world over the past probably 10 years or so.
mhm,
And so a lot's happened over the past 10 years as it relates
mhm,
to video games. But they'll get onto a topic of this. And one thing I've learned, and this is part of that curiosity piece again, is that when like I am curious about their world, even if I don't understand it, but trying to understand it, not
Mhm,
from a place of frustration trying to understand it, but like true curiosity, it's amazing to see how much they will open up with you
mhm,
when they can be an expert on something towards another person.
mhm,
And I think that carries on into the conversations with other people that we may not know very well.
mhm.
They
Uh,
in a essence, they are the experts on their life, and you want to get to know them, you have to open the doors for them to share their life, and
mhm,
I think that's through curiosity. So, tell me
mhm,
more about, like, that thing you just said about that game, like, well,
mhm,
who is that person that you keep playing as? Like, what's so special about them to you?
mhm.
Just keep the curious conversation going. It would be amazing how much information about them you get and the built of trust that happens between the two of you.
You talk, Matt, about the idea of the importance for all of us in wanting to be seen,
Yeah.
and I think that's something that's really and we don't have to be seen in the deepest ways all the time, but just the sense of like, "Hey, this thing that matters to me."
Seen and for the highly analytical technical person, that doesn't
Mhm.
just mean like visually seen.
Sure.
Like we're talking about like known.
Yeah.
There's a part of me deeper below the surface that has been tapped on in a way of like, I see that part of you in a good way.
Mhm,
Like sometimes we hide those pieces
mhm,
through shame. But there's some of those parts of us that we're like, man, I just wish someone would know that about me.
mhm.
And when they are, it feels great.
We have a, work colleague, Matt and I, who is, he's his inclination is to be an enthusiast about a few different things, but one of his particular things is fishing.
Mm.
And we were at a work retreat up in the Smoky Mountains, real close to where we work, and, there was flowing water and opportunity to fish, and this person wanted to fish, and he did fish, successfully. And later, I stayed in that place longer, and, we did, like, a day retreat, but my wife and I were staying there, and the next day, he texted me, he goes, "Are you fishing?" And I'm like, "No." I go, "It doesn't tickle my endorphins like it does for you." I go, "But I love people who love to fish."
Uh-huh.
And there was kind of this, like, solidarity nod, like, "Okay, yeah." And
Yeah.
because it's true, like, and I go on fishing trips, and I don't really care that much about fishing, and it really is, I think, part of my brain structure, like, what it might get awoken at some point in my life, but it's not there at this point in my
Mhm.
40s,
Mhm.
uh, because I see it. I see when people discover fishing and all that, they'll get so into it, and they'll get it's really it can be a real thing for them. And I go on these fishing trips, every so often to Alaska with a group of friends, and I'll do a little bit of fishing up there because that's what it's for, like, we're on the river for days, and so I'll put you know, a pole in once or twice during the week, but not much more than that. I'm really just
Mhm.
kind of there for the ride, and it confuses a lot of people. They're like, "Well, why do you do this then?" And I'm like, I enjoy you guys. I enjoy being
Yeah.
out here in this, and I'm okay to be like the fishing companion." And,
What did you call yourself the other day? Was it the Sherpa?
the Sherpa, yeah. Like, I'm just kinda and it's and but I find that people aren't put off generally that I'm not into fishing. It does sometimes redirect how conversations go because
Yeah.
I can
Yeah.
only speak the lingo so much.
Yeah, and I like what you're saying because there is somewhat of an assumption in dialogue with another person, and this is also as it relates to trying to build relationships with new people,
Mhm,
that there's this assumption that I have to find someone that carries the same likes, desires,
mhm,
whatever that I do, and 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 to be fair, that does help sometimes. It does kind
mhm,
of kickstart the relationship to be like, "Oh, you like that too? Oh, yeah, have you
mhm,
seen this?" Like, and the kind of back and forth thing happens. Um, but as we're talking about here, it doesn't have to be there for a relationship to be built.
mhm,
You could be coming from different everything, political, religious, like that would be tough, but like you could come from these different spectrums. And if there's still curiosity within the space, and there's two other things that I
mhm,
want to say about this. It's not just curiosity, but curiosity is such a big piece. But if there's curiosity there to learn from the other person, like relationships can be built.
Mhm.
And so, but I think we always enter into new relationships or new meetings with other people with this assumption that I have to find that common ground.
Mm.
And sometimes we can't find it, or we're too afraid to look for it. And so we never actually move deeper or closer to another
Mhm.
person.
Mhm. I think that common ground, Matt, sometimes the common ground could just be like, I'm willing to give you care and attention as a person.
Yeah.
And, it's one of personally, it's one of the things I find very motivating in doing work as a counselor is that I'm interested in lots of different things, but ultimately what I find the most interesting is people.
Yeah.
And that's a commonality so many people bring, and I will approach them in their hobbies and in kind of the small talky sorts of conversations, and there's certain ones I can engage in more easily than others,
Hmm.
um, but
Hmm.
yeah, and I think the other thing you just brought up, Matt, about being curious, because I think sometimes we'll assume, like, "Well, I don't like that thing,"
Yeah.
and it's like, "Well," or "I'm not interested in that thing," or "I don't know anything about that thing," and but maybe you do, or maybe you know more than you think, or
Yeah.
maybe,
Yeah.
and
Are
it
you
just
open to learn or listen about it?
yeah. And
Yeah.
are you okay in some ways just not being the expert in this conversation? Because I know a
Oh,
lot of times people will shift the conversation because they don't feel like they can shine quite in the same way, and that
mm.
makes them uncomfortable, and so the shift,
Well,
the shift response becomes like, "Okay, let's go to this other thing that I
yeah.
can I can feel more comfortable in."
And then it's posturing, it's
Mhm.
peacocking, it's whatever you wanna call it. Like, it's this sense of, like, I'm measuring up to you in certain ways.
Mhm.
And I think, even though we maybe not be able to put words to all that, we can feel it when the
Mhm.
conversation shifts in certain ways to where I feel like I'm being, like, measured against, and
Mhm.
that's very difficult to carry on stuff. I even had a thought. Uh, if anybody's listening to this and single and trying to figure out how to like build relationships that way, is
Mhm.
these things are going to be very valuable to you to
Mhm.
build a relationship. If you can make the conversation about the other person and growing the knowledge of that person,
Mhm.
it's going to go well.
Mhm. And doing
If
it with genuine empathy,
that's right, which
and
is tough,
yeah,
but
yeah.
important. Yeah.
I think of there's the character of, Andy from the TV show The Office, and when he's first introduced, he's using all these ploys of, like, this is how, you know, from the business social manuals of, like, use the person's name a lot, shake their hand extra long,
Yeah.
look
Yeah.
directly into their eye, like,
Yeah.
and that stuff can work to a certain degree on paper, but there's a genuineness that I think that really matters, like, you can make a lot of things work clumsily in conversation or things like that if you care.
Yeah.
And caring doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be this perfectly sanctified person in this moment. And to talk about the context of shared life, say, like in a church community, there are any number of people that you're going to be sitting around or going to events with or things like that that you may not have a lot in common with. You may have a hard time enjoying them.
Mm.
And uh, then the challenge is, how do I do this? And I think sometimes we have this pressure that I've gotta like everybody to make this work, and even this is something I say to counselors. There can be a lot of pressure that counselors feel that they need to like all their clients,
Mm.
and at least how I teach it, I'm like, I don't think that's a requirement. You've gotta want their good. You have to be willing to make their good and their growth a priority in the space.
Mhm.
Whether you like them or not feels kind of morally neutral to me.
Yeah.
You know, I
Yeah.
I I like broccoli. I don't like asparagus. I may be in situations where I need to eat asparagus,
Mhm.
but whether I like it is not the moral issue. And you can say,
Right.
well, people aren't food. There's any number of things
Yeah.
that you will find naturally attractive in another person that
Yeah.
doesn't necessarily have anything to do with their character.
Mhm. Yeah.
And there are things that you're going to find difficult about being with other people that may not represent any fault of theirs. It's just a preference.
Yeah. Yeah.
And how do
Yeah.
we and I think some of where I've on musing on the small talk idea, Matt, is how do we kind of even step past ourselves?
Mm,
Because you talk about the idea of, like, making the other person more central, and I do think that's part of it, so the other person can feel like they matter.
mhm.
But the idea of
Yeah,
even just stepping out of oneself,
yeah.
like, I think that is so
Well,
impactful.
and so there are 2 things that I think to glean from one that we learn in graduate school as it relates to how to carry it's like the basic skills of counseling. I want to just kind of touch on for just a second is the concept of like open-ended questions.
Mhm,
And some people may recognize that phrase and understand it, some aren't. But one thing that was kind of honed in on when I first started learning this practice is how do you ask really good questions? And the difference between open-ended and closed-ended is, in a sense, what elicits a response from the other person to carry the conversation on, or is it shut down? And so, an example would be like, I will use this. I'll use you, David, as a.
mhm.
You talked about asparagus and broccoli. A closed-ended question would be like, "Do you like asparagus?"
No.
And what would you? Okay. So, see, it's like
It ends.
conversation's over,
Yeah.
right? Um, Whereas I could maybe say the phrase of like, "What don't you like about asparagus?"
I can't answer no to that, and that's what, or I could, but it wouldn't make sense, and so it invites more, and that's the openness
Yeah,
of it.
yeah,
I could
and
say,
so
like, yeah,
go ahead.
well, not that it matters, but asparagus. I'm like, "Oh, I just the flavor doesn't really work for me," and it's
Yeah,
just like, it I don't feel it makes things better.
and so here's where curiosity would come into play. It's like, well, what vegetables this is such a wild conversation. It'd be like, this is so boring. But, like, what vegetables do you like? And so another it's a curious,
Broccoli.
open-ended question,
Yeah.
so it keeps the conversation going. I think a lot of times people in nervousness and anxiety of meeting a new person or having that conversation will kind of naturally fall to these closed-ended
Mhm,
questions where we say, "Do you like this? Are you
mhm.
going here tomorrow? What do like that kind of stuff that just it doesn't elicit that kind of thing." The other concept, and do you have anything that you would add to the open-ended question paradigm?
No, it's just the going back to riff on the theme about not being self-centric in it.
Yeah.
I think some of the temptation towards closed questions is we're trying to control the outcome. We're trying to an open-ended question invites the other person to decide where they wanna go in the
Mhm.
conversation, and
Right.
we have to be comfortable with that. We have to
You
be
have to
comfortable with,
allow it to
you
go.
know.
Right, exactly. Well, and you keep bringing up this thing of being others-centered in it, and the concept that I was also thinking about was just this phrase of the empathic listener or, like,
Mhm,
listening with empathy, and so I was doing some research on it, and I found this article that kinda broke it down into 3 words that
mm,
helped elicit what is empathic listening. And the first one was humility, and this is, to a sense, what you keep bringing to the table is I'm committing to meeting the conversation where the partner is or whoever I'm
mhm,
talking to where they are without expectations. I'm not
mhm,
expecting this. I'm not. And so often I think too in like business type conversations where we're trying to sell something, like I'm trying to pull the conversation to a place of where they agree with me or
mm,
align in my and even at times in conversations, this is sometimes a stress as it relates to conversations people have with maybe church leaders or pastoral staff in that kind of sense. You're always kind of waiting for the ask or something that this person is wanting to you to do to help
mhm,
them. And so it's without expectation or any of that stuff. And so you have to kind of release this sense of assuming that the conversation is going to turn back to me.
mhm,
And so humility is a crucial part. Um, the second one is curiosity, and we've talked a lot about that. I'm learning about topic ideas or person that I don't really have maybe interest or expertise in.
mhm,
But how can I learn as they are maybe an expert of this thing?
mhm,
So curiosity, and then I'll let you respond to some of these, David. But and then lastly is actually empathy. we talked about that phrase, and so I want to maybe highlight it for a minute. But empathy really is the sense of I am focusing on the feelings, experiences, reactions of the person. It's less about what I feel, but trying to imagine what they are feeling
Mhm,
or learning what they are feeling.
mhm,
Again, curiosity.
mhm,
Sometimes I think with empathy, we have shared experience where, like, we've talked about this on the podcast, I'm pretty sure, but the loss of my mom in 2010,
mhm,
when I talk with people who have lost a parent, sooner than they wanted, and that happens with most parents, but especially kind of like when you're young.
mhm,
Um, I have an empathy in the sense of a shared experience. Like I definitely know to a level similar feelings and thoughts that this person has. I don't know it perfectly because they're a different person,
mhm,
but I know some of it. Now, I don't know what it's like to hold a level of trauma towards a related thing like abuse or war
mhm,
trauma or something like that. I don't have that. But what
mm,
I can do is try to learn their emotions and try to understand and feel them the same way. And so that's what we say about empathy. But if
mhm,
in the process, that's some of the things that I've learned in the counseling process that I would love to share. Now, obviously, some of these things you're not going to do with like a first meeting with somebody, but just to hold conversation, if you want it to go deeper, is to hold these three things of humility, curiosity, and empathy.
mhm.
But David, what do you think about that?
I think all that sounds good.
Good.
The humility bit,
Yeah.
as the kind of the first piece, as you were talking about that, it made me think of, and I'm paraphrasing C.S. Lewis out of Mere Christianity,
Mm.
because he kind of unpacks humility as one of the main virtues of Christian life in that book, and saying that one of the marks of somebody who's humble is you don't really think that much about them being humble. That, humility in its true sense doesn't really like draw attention to itself like, oh, that person's so humble.
Yeah.
It may be that if someone else makes a comment, it'll be like, oh, have you noticed how like how humble Matt is? That you feel like, yeah, I really do. But it's in its unremarkableness that
Yeah.
humility really happens. And it's because it's this idea of it's not really this fawning
Mm.
posturing, to use a word that
Yeah.
you used earlier
Yeah.
sort of thing. It just it goes back to this point of a truly humble person doesn't feel very self-involved. And not in a self-loathing or, not really caring for yourself sort of way, though that is an extreme that people can go to. It's just more of they they seem less concerned
Mm.
than they do with you or with
Mhm.
whoever else they're interacting with.
Mhm.
It's a, service kind of mindset.
Yeah.
And with that being the first one, the other 2 points, I think, just lead really well into it. Like, if you are not overly focused on yourself, that naturally leads into curiosity. I'm not just thinking about what's the next thing I'm going to say, what's the next
Yeah.
thing. Like, if I'm really engaged with you, then in a more naturalistic sort of way, it's gonna lead to like, "Huh, I don't really know much about that. Tell me more about this."
Mhm.
Um, and in that, and then moving from the curiosity to the empathy, I think it does as we're truly listening and engaging with that other person. And again, it's not that ourselves aren't present because
Right. Yeah.
for empathy, part of how we empathize well is we kind of cross-reference in our mind the experiences or perspectives or
Yeah.
opinions that other people are giving us with our own experiences,
Mhm.
yeah, lived experiences, perspective, values. And sometimes that will bring in the natural point of the conversation, like, huh, like I don't know what that's like really, but this is my point of reference. And that's
Mhm.
something I oftentimes will do in counseling because as you highlighted that you may have clients that have interest or hobbies that you know next to nothing about. And I've certainly had that in
Mhm.
teenagers, precisely that. And I really do try to engage with them and I try to really be curious. And the benefit of living in the age that we do is I can Wikipedia things And I do because,
Hmm.
clients will talk about a show or they're really into anime or they're really into, something.
Yeah.
And I can at least get a encyclopedic entry level of knowledge into it
Yeah.
pretty quickly.
Yeah.
But then I'll begin thinking about like, they're as they delve into things about their own lives and their own experiences, I'll say, look, I don't know what this is like. And I'll be very upfront with that. I don't know what it's like, but here's what I imagine it's like. And that
Mm,
imagining is being informed by my own experiences. I'm
that's
thinking
right.
about I think about this a lot when I'm sitting with people who are parents. And I'm not a parent, but I do
Yeah.
try to think about my
Yeah.
relationships with others, with family members, and how I would imagine feeling in that. And
Yeah.
often expressing that to them, even though I'm using myself and my own story as a cross reference, helps them feel heard.
Mm,
Because I'll,
mm.
I'll I'll be like, man, I don't know what it's like. You were mentioning with your daughter and her dealing with food issues years
Yeah.
ago without knowing her milk allergy, and we were talking about that in a hopefully positive listening experience. What
Mhm.
I can imagine saying at some point and be like, I that sounds so rough. I can't imagine what that feels
Mm.
like. I Here's what I think about. I just think about like the fear of
Oh,
like,
yeah.
here's this
Yeah.
person who I care so much about, and she can't communicate to me what's going on, but clearly something's
Yeah.
wrong, and my sense
Yeah.
of helplessness in that.
Yeah.
And
Mm.
I'm what's giving me those words is as I'm just imagining myself in that situation.
Exactly. Yeah.
So,
And so what that elicits in me as you
mhm,
share it is the ability to feel heard or
mhm,
seen. And then when I hear those things, so even as you say it, like just from, we've known each other for years now, but
mhm,
for you saying that I attach to the word fear that you shared
mhm,
by saying, I imagine the fear that you have, like fear stuck out to me. I'm like, that's it. Yes. Like I did. I kind of felt afraid of this thing, so like it makes
mhm,
me want to go deeper with you
mhm,
of that acknowledgement of something that I don't always attach to.
mhm,
Like I wasn't like ready to say to you, "Oh, I felt afraid."
mhm,
But you kind of helped pull it out of me in that sense. And so obviously I understand as people listen to this, they're like, "Yeah, but you guys are trained counselors. You do it all the time and all this stuff." And
and true, and it
it's
does mean that
it's
we're
fair.
practiced,
It's
but
fair.
and it doesn't have to be, and I wanna even highlight as Matt was reflecting too, I you you do not have to mind read to do this well.
Exactly.
You just have to imagine and be curious because there was Matt highlighted a word that I said that he attached to and that kind of pulled that out, but that wasn't the only word I said. That was just the
Right.
one that resonated with him, and
Right.
you can say many things, and
Yeah.
it may be of the 10, emotion-based words that you decide to use, 1
Yeah.
draws them out, and that's okay. That's all that's required.
Yeah.
Um, so you don't have to and in fairness too, one of the reasons that Matt and I are fairly good at this is just because we're practiced. It's not because we have necessarily an ability that other people don't have, but you do if you drive I'm pretty competent in driving large vehicles, but if I was a truck driver, I'd be more competent just because I would do it all the time.
Yeah. And through the practice though, here's one thing that I would say is that I don't know if I could say this well. The practice comes though from also there's kind of in this profession you have to commit to it, otherwise you do
Mhm,
poor work. But is making the conversation about the other person. There is
mhm,
like in most of the conversations that I have throughout the day that are counseling related, obviously, you have to have like you must make the conversation about the client, right? Like it's not about you, the therapist. And so that I think is even the sense of practice is making this about what am I learning from this person and walking with them through. Now, I
mhm,
don't necessarily carry that into my normal conversations because I can't treat every conversation as like my goal is to walk with you through X, Y, and Z. Not everyone wants
mhm.
me to be their therapist. Call my wife, she'll tell you. And so, uh, but what I think I have carried into small talk that's worked, whether I'm sitting at a table with people I don't know, is these principles of making the conversation about them.
Mhm,
And it has worked. And it's been really cool to watch. Um, I want to give us, before we run out of time, I want to give us a few verses. They're short that I think
mhm,
just speak to the element of this is not
mhm,
just social science. This is not just things that we made up on the fly, or just even counseling practices. I think these are scriptural things that have been called into. So I'm going to kind of work backwards on my list here, but Galatians 6:2, we mentioned it in our previous podcast, but it says, bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. We're called to this act of love. Like the law of Christ is basically love. And so to love one another is to kind of sit with each other's burdens. Now, in small talk, you probably won't go to the place of burdens. But the more you keep these three principles of humility, curiosity, and empathy in play, you're going to pull things out of people that are going to reveal their burdens. And so how do you walk alongside them in it? And then Romans 12:15 says, rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. I love that because there are times of celebration, there's times of sadness, and to hold space with people and not just say like, so here's a small talk, spiritual bypass moment, sitting at a church with, people that you don't know very well. You're having a meal together and someone says, it's been a pretty rough week. Well, God's going to bless you in that. It's like,
move on.
Move on.
along, sir.
Yeah. We're not here to talk about your problems.
You're
It's not
highlighting
weeping with those that weep.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the biggest ways in reference to the Romans 12 verse that the shift response will happen. Like, hey man, how you doing?
It's been a rough week. Yeah.
Yeah. Here's this other. Now I'm going to take this in the other direction.
Sorry,
but God's good, and here's here's this other thing, and versus like, no, stay with them.
Yeah,
stay with them, and I think that's part of what it is, and it doesn't have to be like. I think sometimes in grief, we often feel that what we have to offer feels incomplete.
Yeah,
but just your willingness to offer it, I think, matters. And I've experienced sorts of things where people who I don't know super well but I think about the context of church, will ask me the question of like, well, how are things going? And I desire when in the ways that I can to answer authentically. And when I'm not doing great, I don't want to put on that I am for the most part. And so I've had those questions put to me, and I'll say like, it's okay. It's been some rough stuff kind of going on this week.
Yeah.
And I think of one person in particular, again, not someone I know really well, but their response to me in that is, I don't know what it is that's going on for you, but I want you to know I'm really sorry for whatever it is. And that like, I'm, you basically just, it wasn't much more than that, just kind of wanting to show some solidarity and support.
Yeah.
And that meant a lot. And there wasn't, the conversation didn't go beyond that.
Yeah.
I didn't dive into what was going on with me, but I didn't feel redirected because I think part of that redirection ultimately feels like rejection. Like what I'm bringing to you, you don't want.
It's too heavy. It's too much.
Yeah.
I don't want that. Yeah. Finally, the last verse is 1 Peter 3:8, and it says, finally, all of you have unity of mind, sympathy, brotherly love, a tender heart, and a humble mind. And I think that just encapsulates the three pieces of what, again, we started with small talk, but it's just basic like conversation between two people that can make it go to better spaces than the shallow ends. And so,
it's a good conversation, Matt.
I'm
grateful to have it. And we've got a few more episodes we're going to put out for this season, and then Matt and I are going to take a pause. We're not done. It was just more of we've been, as we highlighted in a recent episode that we recorded talking about fatigue. That's part of it. And so it is.
We've been going hard, man.
We're reaching the end of a calendar year, and we're going to tell you some more in some future episodes of what we're looking for the next season to kind of how that we're planning for that to shape, Lord willing, in that. But Matt, I again, just I'm one of the things I really like is I do find that in these conversations that even as we're recording them, I begin thinking about new things. Some of my, my fumbling, my pausing in when we're talking is oftentimes I'm like, okay, what? That's really like that's hitting me in different ways. And so I think this was a cool conversation. I'm grateful to have it with you.
Yeah. Well, thank you all for listening to it as well. And we look forward to talking to you again next time. Thank you again for being a part of our latest episode of Church Psychology. If you have enjoyed it, we hope that you will share this episode with others in your life. And please do remember to follow, like, and/or subscribe to Church Psychology wherever you're finding us, and leave us a review. We look forward to connecting with you again soon.